Welcome to SOC 101, Security Operations Mastery. Over the next hour you'll build the working vocabulary and hands-on judgment of a Tier 1 to Tier 2 Security Operations Center analyst, the person who sits behind the alert queue and decides, in real time, whether something is noise or an actual attacker. We'll move through 4 domains: SOC Fundamentals, Phishing Analysis, Network Security, and Endpoint Security, each weighted the way real analyst work is weighted, with phishing and network monitoring taking up the bulk of your day. Along the way you'll get concrete artifacts, the kind of evidence a real analyst produces, plus the mistakes juniors make so you can skip them, and 2 rounds of interview questions at the end. This isn't theory for its own sake. Everything here maps directly to what happens on a live queue. A Security Operations Center is the team and tool set responsible for continuously monitoring an organization's environment, detecting suspicious activity, and responding before it becomes a breach. It exists because prevention always fails. Eventually firewalls get misconfigured, users click things, patches lag, so every mature security program assumes something will get through and staffs people to catch it fast. The business case is simple: the cost of a SOC is predictable and budgeted, the cost of an undetected breach is not. Mean time to detect and mean time to respond are the numbers that separate a near miss from a headline. A SOC can be a handful of analysts watching one console, or a 24/7, follow-the-sun operation spanning continents, but the mission is identical: see it, understand it, stop it, and prove what happened. Most SOCs run a tiered model. Tier 1 analysts triage the alert queue. They take the flood of automated alerts, apply first-pass judgment, and decide what's a false positive, what needs a ticket, and what needs to escalate immediately. Tier 2 analysts get the escalations, deeper investigation, correlating multiple data sources, and confirming scope and impact. Tier 3 often threat hunters or incident responders handle the hardest cases, proactive hunting, and major incident response. A simple example: an antivirus alert for a known adware sample gets closed at Tier 1 in minutes. A higher severity example: unusual PowerShell execution combined with an outbound connection to a rare domain gets escalated to Tier 2, who pulls process trees and network logs before deciding if it's an incident. Evidence artifact: the escalation note itself, what was seen, what was checked, and why it moved up a tier. Common mistake: junior analysts escalate everything out of caution, which floods Tier 2 and erodes trust in their judgment over time. Organizations build their SOC one of 3 ways. In-house SOCs give full context and control but are expensive to staff around the clock. Managed security service providers, or MSSPs, are outsourced monitoring vendors, cheaper and always on, but with less institutional knowledge of your environment, which can slow triage. Hybrid models are increasingly common. An internal team handles Tier 2 threats and business context, while an MSSP covers Tier 1 overnight and weekend alert volume. A small fintech startup might run pure MSSP until they can afford in-house headcount. A bank might run hybrid, with the MSSP as a 2 a.m. safety net while in-house staff own investigations. Evidence artifact: the shared runbook or escalation matrix defining exactly what the MSSP is authorized to act on versus what must come back to the internal team. Common mistake: assuming an MSSP understands your business critical assets the way an internal analyst does without a maintained asset inventory shared with them. Their alerts lack context and get either over or under escalated. Everything a SOC protects maps back to the CIA triad: confidentiality, keeping data away from people who shouldn't see it; integrity, ensuring data isn't altered without authorization; and availability, keeping systems up and usable. A ransomware attack hits availability and integrity at once: files encrypted, systems down. A quiet data exfiltration hits confidentiality with no availability impact at all, which is exactly why it's harder to catch. Defense in depth is the operating principle that follows: never rely on one control. Layer firewalls, endpoint detection, identity controls, and monitoring so that if one layer fails, the next one catches it. Evidence artifact, a control mapping diagram showing which layer would have caught a given incident, used in post-incident reviews. Common mistake, analysts focus only on the alert in front of them and forget to ask which triad property is actually being threatened. That framing changes urgency and who needs to be notified. Every incident, big or small, moves through the same life cycle: detect, triage, analyze, respond, and close, with lessons learned feeding back into detection. Detection is the alert firing. Triage is the fast first judgment, real or noise. Analysis is where you build the full picture: scope, root cause, what was touched. Response is containment and remediation, isolating a host, resetting credentials, blocking a domain. Close means documenting the verdict and, critically, tuning detection so the same thing is caught faster next time. A simple example: a phishing email reported by a user is detected, triaged as credible within minutes, analyzed to confirm no credentials were entered, and closed with a mail flow rule added. A higher severity example: a confirmed ransomware deployment moves through the same 5 stages but with incident command, legal, and executive stakeholders pulled in at the response stage. Evidence artifact, the incident timeline, timestamped actions from detection to closure. Common mistake, skipping the lessons learned step, so the same detection gap gets rediscovered by a different analyst months later. A SIEM security information and event management platform is the SOC central nervous system. It ingests logs from firewalls, endpoints, identity providers, cloud platforms, and applications, normalizes them into a common format, and applies correlation rules that turn scattered events into a single alert worth a human's attention. Without correlation, a failed login is just noise. Correlated with 9 other failed logins from the same source in 60 seconds, it becomes a brute force alert. A simple example: a correlation rule flags 5 failed VPN logins followed by 1 success from a new country. A higher severity example: correlating a phishing click, followed by new scheduled task creation, followed by outbound traffic to a rare domain. 3 unrelated looking logs that together tell an intrusion story. Evidence artifact, the correlation rule definition itself, showing which log sources and thresholds triggered the alert. Common mistake, treating the SIEM as ground truth rather than a lens. If log sources aren't properly on board, the SIEM can't correlate what it never received. SOCs are run on numbers, and analysts are judged by them too. Mean time to detect, MTTD, measures how long a threat sits unnoticed. Mean time to respond, MTTR, measures how fast the team acts once detected. Alert to ticket ratio shows what fraction of raw alerts actually warrant a ticket. A low ratio signals either excellent tuning or an under-triaging analyst. False positive rate tracks how much of the queue is noise. A rate that's too high burns out analysts and risks real threats getting buried. A simple example: a SOC with MTTD of 4 hours on phishing is doing well, 4 hours on a live ransomware deployment is a disaster. A higher severity example: a spike in false positive rate after a new detection rule ships usually means the rule needs tuning, not that the analysts are underperforming. Evidence artifact, the weekly metrics dashboard used in shift handoff and leadership reporting. Common mistake, chasing a low false positive rate by suppressing rules, which quietly increases MTTD on real threats. Day to day, a SOC's queue is dominated by a handful of recurring threat categories. Malware commodity and targeted shows up via endpoint alerts and unusual process behavior. Phishing dominates the initial access category and is covered in depth in its own section. Insider threats, whether malicious or careless, show up as unusual data access or exfiltration patterns from a legitimate account. Lateral movement is what happens after initial compromise, as an attacker pivots from one host to more valuable systems using stolen credentials or exploited trust relationships. A simple example: a user downloading an unusually large volume of files from a shared drive on a Friday evening. A higher severity example: a compromised service account authenticating to a domain controller it has never touched before, A classic lateral movement signature. Evidence artifact, a threat category tag applied at triage, which feeds trend reporting over time. Common mistake, analysts pattern match to malware or phishing because those are familiar, and underweight insider and lateral movement indicators, which look normal until context is added. Working SOC stitches together several tool categories, and every scene from here forward will reference one of them. The SIEM correlates logs. Endpoint detection and response, EDR, watches individual machines for malicious behavior and can isolate them remotely. IDS/IPS intrusion detection and prevention systems inspect network traffic for known bad patterns, either alerting or actively blocking. A ticketing system tracks every alert from open to close with an auditable trail. Threat intelligence platforms enrich alerts with context. Is this IP known bad? Is this domain newly registered? Has this file hash been seen before? A simple example, an EDR alert on a suspicious process gets enriched with threat intel showing the file hash is a known Trojan. A higher severity example, an IDS alert on outbound traffic gets correlated in the SIEM with an EDR detection on the same host, confirming a single incident rather than two unrelated alerts. Evidence artifact, the tool to alert mapping in a runbook, so analysts know which console to check first. Common mistake, analysts default to the tool they're most comfortable in and miss corroborating evidence sitting in a different console. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. That's the operating rule for every SOC. Every alert that gets a human look needs a ticket recording what was seen, what was checked, the verdict, and the reasoning behind it. This matters for three reasons: shift handoff, so the next analyst doesn't repeat your work; audits and compliance, which often require proof that alerts were reviewed; and chain of custody, which matters if an investigation ever escalates to legal or law enforcement. Evidence handled or stored improperly can become unusable. A simple example, a closed false positive ticket still needs a one-line justification, not just a status change. A higher severity example, an incident that later goes to legal needs every artifact timestamps, who touched what system, exact commands run preserved exactly as collected. Evidence artifact, the ticket itself is the artifact; a well-written one lets a stranger reconstruct your reasoning 6 months later. Common mistake, closing tickets with not malicious and no supporting detail, which is worthless in an audit and useless to the next analyst. Quick checkpoint before we move to phishing. You should now be able to explain, in your own words, the difference between Tier 1, 2, and 3 responsibilities, why defense in depth matters more than any single control, the 5 stages of the incident life cycle, what a SIEM correlation rule actually does, and the difference between MTTD and MTTR. If any of those feel shaky, this is the natural pause point to rewind before the pace picks up. Phishing is the densest section of the tutorial and builds directly on the vocabulary you just covered. Phishing analysis starts with understanding how email actually moves, because every forensic clue lives in that structure. SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, is what carries a message from sender to recipient across a chain of mail servers, and every server it touches adds a received header, building a time-stamped hop-by-hop trail. A message has 2 parts that matter to an analyst: the headers, which contain routing and authentication metadata invisible in a normal inbox view, and the body, which contains the actual content and any links or attachments. A simple example, viewing a message's raw source in Outlook or Gmail reveals a dozen headers a normal reader never sees. A higher severity example, a message claiming to be from a CFO shows an entirely different originating IP and mail server than every previous legitimate message from that person. Evidence artifact, the full raw email source, saved before any triage begins, since some mail clients strip headers on forward. Common mistake, analyzing a forwarded copy of a phishing email instead of the original raw source. Forwarding can alter or drop headers you need. Not all phishing is the same, and the label affects how you respond. Standard phishing is mass, untargeted, cast at volume hoping a small percentage bite. Spear phishing is targeted at a specific person or small group, often using real details, a name, a project, a vendor relationship to seem credible. Whaling is spear phishing aimed specifically at executives, where the payoff for the attacker is much higher, often wire fraud or credential theft aimed at financial approval authority. Smishing and vishing move the same tactics to SMS text messages and voice calls respectively, bypassing email security controls entirely. A simple example, a generic "your package couldn't be delivered" text is smishing. A higher severity example, a call impersonating IT support asking an executive's assistant to reset an MFA device is vishing aimed at bypassing multi-factor authentication. Evidence artifact, the taxonomy tag on the ticket, since it drives which controls get reviewed afterward. Email rules don't help against phishing. Common mistake, treating every user report as just phishing without noting the channel, which causes teams to tune only email controls while voice and SMS vectors go unaddressed. Every phishing investigation, no matter how it starts, should follow the same 5 steps, because consistency is what makes you fast under pressure. First, intake, capture the report exactly as it arrived, raw source, timestamp, reporter. Second, header analysis, check routing and authentication for spoofing tells. Third, link and attachment analysis, examine anything the recipient could click or open, safely. Fourth, verdict, decide malicious, suspicious, or benign, with reasoning documented. Fifth, response, contain, remediate, and communicate, matched to severity. A simple example, a suspicious but unconfirmed email gets a monitor verdict with a mailbox rule added as precaution. A higher severity example, a confirmed credential harvesting page triggers immediate mailbox purge across the organization and a password reset for anyone who clicked. Evidence artifact, a standard 5-step checklist template attached to every ticket, so no step gets skipped under time pressure. Common mistake, jumping straight to a verdict based on gut feel and skipping header or link analysis. That verdict won't survive review, and it teaches nothing that improves detection. 3 header fields matter most when hunting spoofing: from, which is what the recipient sees and is trivially forgeable; reply to, which quietly redirects any reply to an address the attacker controls, often different from the visible sender; and return path, which shows where bounce messages actually go and frequently exposes the true sending infrastructure. A simple example, a from field showing a trusted vendor's name, but a reply to pointing to a free webmail address, a classic mismatch. A higher severity example, a return path domain that resolves to infrastructure hosting dozens of other unrelated phishing campaigns, discoverable through passive DNS lookups. Evidence artifact, a side-by-side header comparison table from, reply to, return path, and originating IP pasted directly into the ticket. Common mistake, checking only the from field and calling it clean, when reply to or return path tells the real story. Attackers know most users, and some junior analysts, never look past the display name. These 3 standards are how email authentication actually works, and reading their verdicts correctly is core analyst skill. SPF, Sender Policy Framework, proves whether the sending server was authorized by the domain owner to send mail for that domain. DKIM, Domain Keys Identified Mail, proves the message content wasn't altered in transit, using a cryptographic signature. DMARC ties the two together and tells receiving servers what to do when SPF or DKIM fail: quarantine, reject, or do nothing. A simple example, an email that passes SPF but fails DKIM suggests the message was relayed or modified after sending. A higher severity example, a domain with no DMARC policy at all is trivially easy to spoof, since there's no instruction telling receiving servers how to handle authentication failures. Evidence artifact, the authentication results header, which spells out pass or fail for all 3 in one line. Common mistake, seeing SPF, pass and assuming the email is legitimate. SPF only validates the sending server, not the actual from address a user sees, which is exactly the gap attackers exploit with domain lookalikes. Beyond headers and authentication, the sending domain's history is a strong signal. A domain registered days ago sending high-volume mail to your organization is far more suspicious than one that's been active for a decade. Reputation services track how a domain and its sending IPs have behaved historically: spam complaints, prior malware campaigns, block list appearances. A simple example, a domain registered 3 days ago, styled to look like a known vendor, is an immediate red flag regardless of content. A higher severity example, a compromised but legitimate, decade-old vendor domain suddenly sending phishing reputation checks alone won't catch this, which is why you never rely on one signal in isolation. Evidence artifact, a HOI lookup and reputation service screenshot attached to the ticket, time-stamped at time of investigation since domain reputation changes. Common mistake, treating an aged, reputable domain as automatically safe. Compromised legitimate infrastructure is one of the most effective phishing vectors precisely because it defeats age and reputation checks. Attackers rarely put a raw malicious URL in an email, they hide it. Deobfuscation means unpacking URL shorteners, encoded characters, and nested redirect chains to find where a link actually lands. Redirect chains often hop through several legitimate-looking services: a URL shortener, then a cloud storage redirect, then a compromised WordPress site before reaching the final credential harvesting page, specifically to evade automated scanners that only check the first hop. Typo squatting is the other core pattern. Domains like rnicrosoft.com or paypa1.com that exploit visual similarity to a trusted brand. A simple example, a shortened link that a deobfuscation tool reveals redirects once to its true destination. A higher severity example, a 5-hop redirect chain where only the final hop serves malicious content, and where the URL shown to the user never changes because of an open redirect vulnerability on a trusted domain. Evidence artifact, the full resolved redirect chain, hop by hop, documented in the ticket. Common mistake, checking only the visible link text or the first redirect and missing that the real destination is several hops deeper. You never click a suspicious link from your own machine or network. Sandboxing means detonating a URL in an isolated environment, a dedicated analysis VM with no connection to production, or a cloud detonation service built for exactly this so you can observe where it leads and what it does without any risk to your organization. This also captures evidence that changes over time, since attackers often serve a clean page to known security vendor IP ranges and the real payload only to everyone else. A simple example, a detonation service renders the page and confirms it's a credential harvesting form styled to look like a Microsoft 365 login. A higher severity example, a URL that behaves differently based on visitor IP, serving benign content to known scanner ranges and a browser exploit to everyone else only caught because the sandbox used a residential style IP. Evidence artifact, a screenshot of the rendered page plus the detonation service's full report, both attached to the ticket. Common mistake, opening a suspicious link in a regular browser tab just to look, even briefly. That's a direct connection from corporate infrastructure to attacker-controlled content. Attachments carry their own risk profile, separate from links. Office documents with macros Word, Excel remain one of the most common malware delivery vectors, because a macro is essentially a small program a user can be tricked into running with one click. PDFs can embed malicious JavaScript or exploit rendering vulnerabilities. Executables and script files, disguised with double extensions like invoice.pdf.exe, rely on hidden file extensions to fool a quick glance. The core distinction is static versus dynamic analysis. Static analysis examines the file without running its structure, embedded strings, macro code. Dynamic analysis runs the file in an isolated sandbox and observes what it actually does. A simple example, static analysis alone reveals an Excel file contains an auto-executing macro before you ever need to run it. A higher severity example, a macro that looks benign in static review turns out to download a second stage payload only when dynamically detonated, because it deliberately delays execution to evade quick sandboxes. Evidence artifact, the file hash, submitted to threat intel platforms, plus static analysis output. Common mistake, relying on file extension alone to judge risk. Double extensions and disguised icons defeat a glance every time. Static analysis tools let you look inside a suspicious document without ever opening it in the application it's designed for. Tools in this category extract embedded macro code as readable text, pull strings that reveal hard-coded URLs or IP addresses, and flag suspicious API calls a macro might use, like ones for auto-execution or process creation. This lets you build a picture of intent before any detonation. A simple example, extracting macro source reveals a hard-coded download URL sitting in plain text. A higher severity example, the macro code is deliberately obfuscated, base 64 encoded, split across variables, reassembled at runtime requiring manual deobfuscation before the true intent, usually a downloader for a second stage payload, becomes visible. Evidence artifact, the extracted, deobfuscated macro source pasted into the ticket alongside the original hash. Common mistake, stopping analysis as soon as an obfuscated blob is found, logging it as suspicious without pushing through the deobfuscation. That's often the single piece of evidence that would confirm malicious intent versus a false positive. Every phishing investigation should end with a clean list of indicators of compromise, or IOCs, the concrete, shareable artifacts that let other systems and teams detect the same threat elsewhere. The core IOC types are file hashes, which uniquely fingerprint a malicious file, IP addresses, which identify infrastructure, and domains, which identify the campaign's web presence. A simple example, a single confirmed phishing email yields one sender domain, one malicious URL domain, and one attachment hash. A higher severity example, a targeted campaign against multiple executives yields a cluster of related domains registered within days of each other, several IPs sharing hosting infrastructure, and a family of related file hashes, evidence of a coordinated operation, not an isolated email. Evidence artifact, a structured IOC list, formatted for direct import into the SIEM or firewall block list, not just pros in a ticket. Common mistake, recording IOCs only in ticket text instead of a structured, importable format. That gap is exactly why we saw this before. Doesn't always translate into we blocked it everywhere. Once a verdict is confirmed malicious, response has to move fast and match scope. Quarantine isolates the message so it can't be opened by anyone who hasn't already interacted with it. Blocking adds the sender domain, URL, or file hash to email gateway and firewall block lists so future copies are stopped automatically. Purging removes copies from every mailbox that already received the message, including ones a user may have already read or moved to a folder. A simple example, a single reported phishing email is quarantined from the one recipient's inbox. A higher severity example, a campaign sent to 200 employees requires an org-wide purge across every mailbox, plus a check for anyone who clicked before the purge completed, since those users may need credential resets regardless of quarantine status. Evidence artifact, the purge/block action log, showing exactly which mailboxes and systems were touched and when. Common mistake, quarantining only the reported copy and assuming that's sufficient, without checking whether the same campaign landed in other inboxes that never got reported. Reactive response stops the current incident, proactive defense reduces the next one. User awareness training builds the instinct to pause on urgency and check senders before clicking. The highest leverage, lowest cost control a SOC influences but doesn't directly own. Mailflow rules add automated guardrails, banner warnings on external senders, blocking specific high-risk attachment types, or flagging lookalike domains automatically. A visible report phishing button turns every employee into a sensor feeding the SOC real-time data instead of relying purely on automated detection. A simple example, an external sender banner alone causes a noticeable drop in click-through on subsequent campaigns. A higher severity example, after a targeted whaling attempt against finance leadership, A mail flow rule specifically flags any email requesting wire transfers or W2 data from an external sender. Evidence artifact, click-through and report rate trends over time, the clearest proof proactive controls are working. Common mistake, running one annual training session and calling awareness handled retention drops sharply within months without ongoing reinforcement. A well-written phishing ticket does three jobs at once. It proves the investigation was thorough, it lets anyone reconstruct your reasoning later, and it speaks to multiple audiences at once. A fellow analyst needs the technical evidence, while a manager or auditor needs the verdict and impact in plain language. The structure that works: evidence first, headers, IOCS, sandbox results, laid out cleanly, verdict next, stated clearly with confidence level, remediation actions taken, with timestamps, and a short plain language summary at the top for anyone who won't read past the first paragraph. A simple example: a benign verdict ticket still documents what was checked, even briefly, so the reasoning is auditable. A higher severity example: an incident ticket destined for legal review needs every timestamp, every system touched, and every command run, preserved exactly and without editorializing. Evidence artifact: a ticket template with these four sections built in as required fields, so nothing gets skipped under deadline pressure. Common mistake: burying the verdict at the bottom of a wall of technical text right for the reader who has 30 seconds, then for the reader who has 30 minutes. A few mistakes show up again and again in junior analyst work, and naming them is the fastest way to avoid them. Analyzing a forwarded copy instead of the raw original source, which can strip or alter headers you need. Trusting a single authentication result SPF pass as proof of legitimacy, when SPF only validates the sending server, not the visible from address. Clicking a link directly instead of using a sandbox, even just to check. Stopping investigation the moment one IOC is found instead of pulling the full set a campaign might involve. And closing tickets with a verdict but no supporting evidence, which fails audits and teaches the next analyst nothing. Evidence artifact: a personal or team checklist built specifically from this list, reviewed during onboarding and again after any near miss. Common mistake: the meta one, assuming experience alone prevents these errors. Even senior analysts make them under time pressure, which is exactly why checklists exist regardless of tenure. Before moving to network security, make sure you can walk through the 5-step methodology from intake to response, what SPF, DKIM, and DMARC each actually prove, and why an SPF pass alone isn't proof of legitimacy, the difference between static and dynamic attachment analysis, and the 3 core IOC types you'd extract from a confirmed campaign. This section carried the most weight in the tutorial for a reason. Phishing is the single most common initial access vector a SOC deals with, and everything else you investigate often traces back to a click that started here. You don't need to memorize all 7 OSI layers to monitor a network effectively, but 3 matter constantly. Layer 3, the network layer, is where IP addresses and routing live. This is where you track who's talking to whom. Layer 4, the transport layer, is where TCP and UDP live, along with ports. This tells you what kind of traffic it is: web, DNS, remote access. Layer 7, the application layer, is where the actual content lives: HTTP requests, DNS queries, email content. A simple example: a connection on port 443 is almost certainly encrypted web traffic at layer 4, but only layer 7 inspection, where possible, reveals what's actually being requested. A higher severity example: malware communicating over port 443 to blend in with normal web traffic, a technique that defeats port-based filtering alone and requires payload or behavioral inspection to catch. Evidence artifact: a simple packet breakdown showing source, destination, port, and protocol for a flagged connection. Common mistake: assuming a normal port means normal traffic. Attackers deliberately use common ports specifically to blend in. A PCAP, packet capture, is a raw recording of network traffic. Every packet, header, and payload, saved for later analysis. It's the ground truth of what actually crossed the wire, which is why it's often the most trusted evidence in an investigation. But PCAPs are expensive. Full packet capture on a busy network generates enormous storage volume very quickly, which is why most organizations capture selectively on specific segments, triggered by an alert, or with retention limited to a rolling window. A simple example, a targeted capture on a single suspicious host's traffic for an hour is manageable and useful. A higher severity example, full capture across an entire data center during active incident response, accepted as a short-term storage cost because the evidentiary value during a live breach outweighs it. Evidence artifact, the PCAP file itself, hashed at time of capture to preserve chain of custody if it's ever needed for legal proceedings. Common mistake, not knowing your organization's retention window until you need a capture from 3 weeks ago and discover it's already been overwritten. Flow data, NetFlow and similar formats records metadata about a connection, source, destination, ports, duration, and byte counts, without the actual payload. It's lightweight and can be retained for months at a fraction of PCAP storage cost, which makes it excellent for spotting patterns over time. Packet-based analysis, using full PCAPs, gives you the actual content but at much higher storage cost and shorter retention. The right call is knowing when each is enough. A simple example, flow data alone is sufficient to spot a host suddenly talking to 100 new external IPs, a scanning pattern. A higher severity example, confirming that a suspicious connection actually exfiltrated data, not just connected, requires the payload. Flow data can't tell you what left, only that a connection happened. Evidence artifact, a flow-based timeline for the broad pattern, escalating to a targeted PCAP for payload confirmation once a specific window is identified. Common mistake, requesting a full PCAP as a first step for every investigation, when flow data would answer the question in minutes at a fraction of the effort. Dump is the command line packet capture tool available on virtually every Linux system and most network appliances, which makes it the tool you'll reach for when you need a quick capture without a GUI, often over SSH on a remote host. The basic workflow is simple: specify an interface to listen on, optionally a filter to limit what's captured, and where to write the output, either to the screen for a quick look or to a file for later analysis in Wireshark. A simple example, running a capture on the primary interface for 60 seconds gives a quick snapshot of current traffic. A higher severity example, capturing on a specific interface during a suspected active intrusion, writing directly to a file for evidentiary preservation rather than just watching it scroll by, since the file itself becomes evidence. Evidence artifact, the exact dump command used, saved alongside the output file, so the capture conditions are reproducible and defensible later. Common mistake, capturing without a filter on a busy interface, generating gigabytes of irrelevant traffic that bury the signal you actually needed. Filters are what make dump usable at scale instead of an unmanageable fire hose. You can filter by host to capture only traffic to or from a specific IP, by port to isolate a specific service like DNS or HTTP, and by protocol to capture only TCP or only UDP traffic. Filters combine with logical operators, so you can narrow to exactly the traffic pattern you're chasing. A simple example, a filter capturing only traffic to and from one suspicious host isolates that host's activity from everything else on a busy segment. A higher severity example, a combined filter for a specific host on port 53, DNS, and a specific destination used to confirm suspected DNS tunneling, where an attacker hides data exfiltration inside DNS queries. Evidence artifact, the filter expression itself, documented in the ticket, since it defines exactly what was and wasn't captured, relevant if someone later asks whether the capture could have missed something. Common mistake, writing an overly broad filter to be safe, which defeats the purpose and produces the same fire hose problem filtering was meant to solve. Wireshark is the standard GUI tool for analyzing captured traffic in depth, whether live or from a saved PCAP file. The interface has three main panes: the packet list, showing every captured packet in sequence, the packet detail pane, breaking a selected packet down layer by layer, and the hex/ASCII pane, showing the raw bytes. The critical distinction for analysts is capture filters versus display filters. Capture filters, set before recording starts, determine what gets saved at all, anything excluded is gone permanently. Display filters, applied after the fact, just change what you're looking at within a capture you already have, nothing is lost, you can always widen the view. A simple example, applying a display filter for one protocol instantly narrows a busy capture to just that traffic, reversibly. A higher severity example, setting too narrow a capture filter during initial collection permanently excludes traffic that turns out to be relevant hours later, forcing a second capture and losing the original window. Evidence artifact, the saved display filter expression that isolated the traffic of interest, documented for reproducibility. Common mistake, confusing capture and display filters, and setting an overly restrictive capture filter that can never be undone. Follow TCP stream is one of Wireshark's most useful features for an analyst. Instead of reading a connection packet by packet, it reassembles the entire back and forth conversation into readable order, client and server sides clearly separated. This turns a scattered sequence of dozens of individual packets into something closer to a transcript. A simple example, following the stream of an HTTP connection reveals the exact request and response in readable text, immediately showing what was requested and what was returned. A higher severity example, following a stream on a suspicious connection reveals plain text credentials being transmitted over an unencrypted protocol, a finding with immediate remediation implications well beyond the current investigation. Evidence artifact, the reassembled stream output, saved as text and attached to the ticket, since it's far more readable than a packet-by-packet screenshot. Common mistake, manually piecing together a conversation packet by packet in the packet list when follow stream would reconstruct it instantly and far more reliably. If a captured conversation transferred a file, an HTTP download, an SMB file share, an email attachment over an unencrypted protocol, Wireshark can extract that object directly out of the capture, reconstructing the actual file from its constituent packets. This turns network evidence into a file you can analyze the same way you'd analyze a phishing attachment, hash it, submit it to threat intelligence, or run it through sandboxing. A simple example, extracting an image file transferred over HTTP confirms exactly what was downloaded. A higher severity example, extracting an executable transferred over an unencrypted internal file share during a suspected lateral movement incident, then hashing it to confirm it matches a known malware family. Evidence artifact, the extracted file itself, hashed immediately upon extraction, alongside the original PCAP it came from. Common mistake, extracting a file and analyzing it on the same machine used for day-to-day work rather than an isolated analysis environment. Treat any extracted file as live malware until proven otherwise. Wireshark's statistics tools give you the bird's eye view a packet-by-packet read never will. The conversations view summarizes every unique connection in a capture, who talked to whom, how much data, for how long, letting you spot the biggest or most unusual flows at a glance. Protocol hierarchy breaks the capture down by protocol percentage, which is often the fastest way to spot something that doesn't belong, like an unexpected protocol making up a slice of traffic that should be all web and DNS. A simple example, sorting conversations by byte count instantly surfaces the single largest data transfer in a busy capture. A higher severity example, protocol hierarchy reveals a small but present percentage of an unusual protocol never normally seen on that segment, pointing directly at a specific host worth investigating further. Evidence artifact, a screenshot of the relevant statistics view, since it visually supports this, stood out far better than prose alone. Common mistake, diving straight into individual packets on a large, unfamiliar capture instead of starting with statistics to know where to focus first. A handful of traffic patterns show up again and again in real intrusions. Beaconing is regular, low and slow outbound communication at consistent intervals. A compromised host checking in with command and control infrastructure, often disguised inside normal-looking web traffic. Data exfiltration signatures show up as unusually large outbound transfers, especially to destinations a host has never talked to before, or steady trickles designed to stay under volume-based alert thresholds. Port scans show one host rapidly attempting connections across many ports on one or more targets, reconnaissance behavior that usually precedes an actual attack attempt. A simple example: a host reaching out to the same external IP every 60 seconds for hours is a textbook beaconing pattern. A higher severity example: a slow, sustained trickle of outbound data over several days to a rarely used destination, deliberately paced to stay beneath any single alert volume threshold. Evidence artifact: a timeline chart of connection frequency or volume, since these patterns are far easier to see visually than in raw logs. Common mistake: looking only at single connections in isolation instead of connection frequency and volume over time, which is where these patterns actually reveal themselves. An intrusion detection system, IDS, inspects network traffic against known bad patterns and alerts when it finds a match it observes but doesn't act, sitting passively on a mirrored copy of traffic. An intrusion prevention system, IPS, does the same inspection but sits inline in the actual traffic path and can actively block a match in real time, before it ever reaches its destination. The trade-off is risk versus speed. IDS carries zero risk of breaking legitimate traffic since it only observes, while IPS can stop an attack instantly, but a false positive means blocking traffic that was actually legitimate. A simple example: an IDS alert on a known exploit signature lets an analyst review and respond within minutes. A higher severity example: an IPS actively blocks a fast-moving exploit attempt in real time, stopping it before human review is even possible, the only option when reaction time in minutes is too slow. Evidence artifact: the specific signature ID that matched, which ties the alert to a documented, known pattern rather than an ambiguous suspicious traffic label. Common mistake: deploying IPS in blocking mode without first running it in detection-only mode long enough to tune out false positives. An untuned IPS can take down legitimate business traffic. Snort is one of the most widely used open-source IDS/IPS engines, and every Snort rule follows the same anatomy: an action, telling Snort what to do on a match alert, log, or drop; a header, specifying protocol, source, destination, and ports to match against; and options, in parentheses, that define the specific pattern to look for, along with metadata like the rule's message and unique ID. A simple example: a rule with action alert, matching TCP traffic on a specific port, with an option checking for a known bad string in the payload. A higher severity example: a rule chaining multiple options together, content matching, packet size constraints, and flow direction to precisely match a specific exploit's network signature while minimizing false positives on similar looking but benign traffic. Evidence artifact: the exact rule ID that fired, which every analyst can look up to understand precisely what pattern triggered the alert. Common mistake: reading only the alert message and never looking at the actual rule content, missing context about exactly what pattern matched and why. Writing a Snort rule starts with knowing exactly what you're trying to detect: a specific string in a payload, traffic to a known bad IP, or a particular port and protocol combination. You build the rule from the anatomy just covered: action, header, and options, then critically, test it against a known good sample of traffic that should not match, and a known bad sample that should. This two-sided test is what prevents both false positives and rules that silently fail to fire at all. A simple example: a rule written to detect a specific known bad domain in DNS traffic, tested against a capture containing that domain to confirm it fires. A higher severity example: a custom rule written in response to a specific incident, tested against a week of normal production traffic to confirm zero false positives before deployment. Skipping this step is how a single rule can flood a queue with noise. Evidence artifact: the test results themselves, the exact traffic samples used, and whether the rule matched as expected, documented alongside the rule before it goes live. Common mistake: deploying a newly written rule directly to production without testing against clean traffic first, discovering the false positive volume only after analysts are already drowning in alerts. A single network alert rarely tells the full story on its own. Its real value comes from correlation with other telemetry inside the SIEM. An IDS alert on suspicious outbound traffic means something very different depending on what else was happening on that host at the same time. Was there also an EDR alert for a suspicious process, a new scheduled task, or unusual authentication activity moments earlier? A simple example: a standalone port scan alert with no other activity on the source host over the following hours is often deprioritized as noise or automated internet-wide scanning. A higher severity example: that same port scan alert, correlated with a successful login to one of the scanned hosts 20 minutes later, tells a very different story: reconnaissance followed by exploitation. Evidence artifact: a correlated timeline pulling network, endpoint, and identity events into one sequence, built directly in the SIEM. Common mistake: closing a network alert in isolation without checking the SIEM for related events on the same host or account in the surrounding time window. Before moving to endpoint security, confirm you can explain when to use flow data versus a full packet capture, the difference between a capture filter and a display filter in Wireshark, and why that distinction matters, the difference between IDS and IPS and the risk trade-off between them, and how a snort rule is structured: action, header, and options. Network security tends to feel tool-heavy on first pass. The real skill isn't memorizing dump syntax, it's knowing which tool answers which question fastest. Traditional antivirus works primarily on signatures matching files against a database of known malicious patterns. It's fast and low overhead but blind to anything new. A slightly modified or entirely novel piece of malware simply won't match a known signature. Endpoint detection and response, EDR, takes a fundamentally different approach. It watches behavior continuously: process creation, file changes, network connections, registry modifications, and flags patterns that look malicious regardless of whether the specific file has ever been seen before. A simple example: antivirus catches a well-known commodity Trojan instantly via signature match. A higher severity example: a novel, custom-built piece of malware evades every antivirus signature but still gets caught by EDR, because the behavior it exhibits, process injection, credential dumping, looks malicious no matter how new the file is. Evidence artifact: the EDR behavioral alert, showing the specific process tree and actions that triggered detection, not just a file name. Common mistake: assuming antivirus alone provides adequate endpoint coverage. Signature-based detection alone is now considered insufficient against modern, frequently repacked threats. Modern EDR platforms do three things that make them the backbone of endpoint investigation. Telemetry means continuous, detailed recording of what's happening on every endpoint: process trees, file activity, network connections searchable after the fact even for hosts that weren't flagged at the time something happened. Isolation lets an analyst remotely cut a compromised host off from the network with a single action, stopping lateral movement or exfiltration while the investigation continues, without needing physical access to the machine. Rollback, where supported, can revert file system changes made by ransomware or other malware, restoring affected files without a full restore from backup. A simple example: telemetry search reveals a suspicious process ran on a host 3 days before any alert fired, extending the investigation timeline backward. A higher severity example: a host showing active ransomware encryption is isolated within seconds of detection, containing the blast radius to a single machine instead of a shared network drive. Evidence artifact: the isolation action log, timestamped precisely, since response speed is often the single biggest factor in limiting incident scope. Common mistake: hesitating to isolate a host while seeking more certainty, when speed of containment usually matters more than additional confirmation once behavioral evidence is already strong. Hunting is fundamentally different from alert response. Instead of waiting for a tool to flag something, a hunter proactively searches telemetry for signs of compromise that automated detection might have missed entirely. It starts with a hypothesis based on threat intelligence, a recent incident elsewhere in the industry, or a gap identified in existing detection coverage, and then searches historical telemetry to confirm or rule it out. A simple example: hunting for a specific, newly published malware technique across all endpoints, even though no alert has fired for it yet. A higher severity example: after a peer organization in the same industry reports a specific attack technique, a hunter searches internal telemetry for the same pattern retroactively across the past 90 days, finding evidence of an intrusion that alert-based detection never flagged. Evidence artifact: the hunting query itself, saved and often converted into a permanent detection rule. Once validated, hunting frequently improves the SIEM and EDR rule set for everyone going forward. Common mistake: treating hunting as unstructured, open-ended browsing through logs rather than hypothesis-driven without a specific question to answer. Hunting rarely produces reusable results. Once an attacker has a foothold on one host, the next step is usually spreading further or gaining more access, and both leave artifacts on the endpoint if you know where to look. Lateral movement often shows up as unusual authentication from one internal host to another using credentials that don't normally make that connection, or the use of legitimate admin tools, remote execution utilities built into the operating system in ways that don't match normal administrative patterns. Privilege escalation shows up as a process suddenly running with higher privileges than the account should normally have, or exploitation of a local vulnerability to jump from standard user to administrator. A simple example: a service account that normally only touches one application server suddenly authenticating to a domain controller. A higher severity example: a standard user process spawning a child process running as system, with no legitimate administrative action to explain it, a strong privilege escalation signature. Evidence artifact: the process tree and authentication log correlated together, showing the exact sequence from initial access to escalated privilege. Common mistake: treating built-in administrative tools as inherently safe just because they're native to the OS. Legitimate tools used illegitimately are one of the hardest patterns to catch precisely because they don't trigger malware signatures. A confirmed endpoint incident moves through a consistent workflow: triage first, confirming the alert is real and gauging initial severity; contain next, typically isolating the host to stop further spread while investigation continues; collect, gathering forensic evidence, memory captures, disk images, relevant logs before anything is remediated and potential evidence is altered or lost; and eradicate last, removing the malicious presence and confirming the host is clean before returning it to the network. The ordering matters. Collecting evidence before eradicating is what preserves your ability to understand root cause and full scope. A simple example: a single infected workstation moves through all 4 steps in under an hour. A higher severity example: a server showing signs of a broader compromise requires forensic imaging before any remediation, since remediating first could destroy evidence needed to determine whether other systems were also touched. Evidence artifact: the full chain of custody log for every piece of forensic evidence collected, critical if the incident ever proceeds to legal action. Common mistake: eradicating malware immediately upon discovery, out of urgency, before collecting evidence, destroying the ability to determine scope, root cause, or whether other systems were also compromised. Last checkpoint before we close out. Make sure you can explain the core difference between signature-based antivirus and behavior-based EDR, the 3 EDR capabilities that matter most in an investigation: telemetry, isolation, and rollback, what distinguishes hunting from ordinary alert response, and why the endpoint investigation workflow puts evidence collection before eradication. Endpoint security was the smallest section by design. It mirrors how little runtime the source material spent there relative to phishing and network, but the concepts here are exactly what confirms or disproves everything you hypothesized in the 2 sections before it. For anyone building toward this role, a practical certification path matters more than collecting badges. Entry level, vendor-neutral certifications validate foundational knowledge across the domains you've just covered. From there, hands-on, lab-based certifications that test actual investigation and analysis skill, not just multiple-choice recall, carry real weight with hiring managers, because they prove you can do the work, not just describe it. Beyond certifications, the strongest signal is a documented home lab, a personal SIEM instance, sample PCAPs you've analyzed, and right UPS you can walk an interviewer through. A simple example: a candidate with one foundational certification and a documented home lab project stands out more than one with 3 certifications and nothing to show. A higher severity example: career-wise, candidates who skip hands-on practice entirely often struggle in practical interview exercises even with strong certification credentials on paper. Evidence artifact: your own, a portfolio of right UPS mirroring the ticket structure covered earlier in this tutorial. Common mistake: chasing certification count instead of demonstrable, hands-on skill. Let's walk one incident across everything you've learned. It starts with phishing. An employee clicks a link in a spear phishing email, landing on a credential harvesting page that captures their password. The attacker logs in remotely, and this is where network security enters. Unusual authentication from an unfamiliar location gets flagged, and correlating it against SIEM data confirms the login pattern doesn't match the employee's normal behavior. The attacker moves laterally toward a file server, generating the kind of unusual internal traffic and authentication artifacts covered in the network section. Finally, Endpoint Security catches the tail end. EDR flags unusual process behavior on the file server itself, a sign of data staging before exfiltration, and the host is isolated before data actually leaves the network. One incident, 4 domains, each catching what the previous one missed. This is exactly why SOC Fundamentals emphasized correlation so heavily at the start. No single domain catches everything alone, but together, with good correlation discipline, they very often do. 5 rapid questions spanning everything so far. 1. What's the difference between a Tier 1 and Tier 2 analyst? Tier 1 triages the queue and makes the real versus noise call. Tier 2 investigates escalations in depth. 2. What does an SPF pass actually prove? Only that the sending server was authorized, not that the visible from address is legitimate. 3. What's the difference between a capture filter and a display filter in Wireshark? Capture filters are permanent and set before recording, display filters are reversible and applied after. 4. What's the core difference between antivirus and EDR? Antivirus matches signatures, EDR watches behavior and catches things no signature has ever seen. 5. Why does evidence collection come before eradication in endpoint response? Because remediating first can destroy the evidence needed to determine root cause and full scope. Notice the pattern across all 5. Good SOC answers name the underlying principle, not just the tool. 5 harder, scenario-based questions, the kind that separate memorized definitions from real understanding. 1. An email passes SPF and DKIM but the reply to address is unrelated to the sender domain. What's your next step? Treat it as a strong spoofing indicator regardless of authentication results, and continue full header and link analysis. 2. Flow data shows a host talking to 100 new external IPs in an hour. Walk your investigation. Confirm it's not benign scanning activity, then check for a corresponding EDR alert on that host and whether any connection succeeded, not just attempted. 3. An IPS in blocking mode just took down a legitimate business application. What happened and what's your immediate action? Likely an untuned rule with a false positive. Switch that specific rule to detect only immediately while investigating, rather than disabling the whole IPS. 4. EDR shows a native admin tool being used in an unusual pattern at 2 a.m. Is this automatically malicious? No. Correlate against scheduled maintenance windows and the account's normal behavior before concluding anything. Native tool abuse requires context, not assumption. 5. You're asked to eradicate malware immediately, but you haven't imaged the affected server yet. What do you say? Push back. collection has to happen first, or the organization loses the ability to determine scope, unless active, uncontained damage makes immediate action unavoidable. A few patterns consistently hurt junior candidates, and they're fixable once you know them. Resumes that list tool names with no context. Wireshark, Snort, Splunk as a bullet list tell an interviewer nothing about whether you can actually use them. Describe what you did with each tool instead. In interviews, giving a definition when asked for a process is a common tell. Asked how would you investigate this, candidates often answer with what a term means rather than walking the actual steps. Not knowing your own home lab project in depth is another. If you list it, expect to be asked follow-up questions 3 layers deeper than your resume line. And treating every answer as binary, malicious, or benign. When experienced analysts constantly work in insufficient evidence, here's what I'd check next. Territory signals a lack of real investigative experience. Evidence artifact, for your own prep, mock interview yourself against the scenario questions in the previous 2 scenes and record your actual reasoning, not just your final answer. Common mistake, over-preparing definitions and under-preparing your ability to reason through an unfamiliar scenario out loud. You've now covered the working core of Tier 1 to Tier 2 SOC analyst skill, how a SOC is structured and measured, how to investigate phishing end-to-end, how to read and capture network traffic with purpose, and how endpoint telemetry closes the loop when the earlier signals get missed. The through line across every single scene has been the same: evidence first, verdict second, and always document the reasoning well enough that a stranger could follow it 6 months from now. What to practice next? Build a home lab, capture and analyze your own traffic, write up investigations the way this tutorial modeled tickets, and revisit the 2 interview rounds until the reasoning feels automatic rather than memorized. The alert queue never actually stops moving. The analysts who last in this role are the ones who stay curious about the alert underneath the alert. Good luck out there.